can't reduce healthcare costs immediately. This is going to have to be a long 20-year process, perhaps. So that means that in the short run, we have to find other ways to reduce the debt. And I would say that without doing irreparable, the only way we can not do irreparable harm to basic structures like healthcare and other important priorities is to look at the revenue side of the ledger. And so our initial efforts should be to raise more revenues and let those healthcare costs come down over the long term.
And Ross, did you have anything you'd like to add?
We need to look at revenues. We have lower tax rates in this country than we've had in many decades. And we are doing that in a context of tremendous needs, including unfunded wars, including the challenges on our healthcare system. And, you know, we have spokespeople like Warren Buffett saying, why are you letting us off the hook? So, I mean, I think trying to do this in a cuts-only approach is just not going to make sense. That isn't to take away from the effort. We need to do things smarter. We need to figure out how we can reduce unnecessary loopholes and bad expenditures. But we do need to look at revenues.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Next question.
Don Mitchell with Physicians for Our National Health Program. I'll talk to you later, Andy. All of you have made excellent suggestions, recommendations, but given the influence, the disproportionate influence of corporations and corporate money, what's in Congress, what suggestions do you have to effect these changes to be made by our congressmen? And to say, well, just speak out as individuals is really, I think, a non-answer. It doesn't work, you know. And General Motors has much more influence than 1,000 of us, 10,000 of us. And any thoughts?
Who would like to start? Ryan?
I mean, I think it would be naive to say speaking out as individuals is the same as having a lobbyist in town, in Washington. But at the same time, I think it's a necessary element. And I think, you know, we know as a, we're a small group. I've got $1 million budget and 10 people in, you know, conveniently short storefront office, so it had no earthquake damage. We came up with the name Bridge to Nowhere. We spent 5 years fighting against the Bridge to Nowhere, and we finally got rid of that bridge. We don't have 5 years of the super committee, but, you know, the Margaret Mead phrase, which I am confident somebody in the room here knows what I'm talking about, never underestimate the value of a dedicated group of people. You know, it's up on a lot of people's wall for a reason, that there's just no substitute for organizing amongst yourselves in as many forms as possible. And I would say, talking to people who you think you don't agree with. I mean, obviously that's something we believe in institutionally, that we need to bring together people who start from different perspectives. But we know that the way we're able to be heard and punch above our weight is because we come in and say, hey, you know, we got a report here and we got Friends of the Earth and the Heartland Institute on it. Or we have a report that has $600 billion in defense cuts over 10 years. Or there's $900 billion in cuts over 10 years. And we can get a lot of people to sign on to it from different perspectives. So I think this is a very, very challenging moment to be energized individual citizen in the wake of kind of whatever you want for campaign finance reform. This is a tough moment for individuals. In the wake of you know, the combination of what we have as current laws in the wake of the Citizens United case, it's a difficult moment, but you can't give up.
I think actually Andy wanted to address that too. Oh, okay, but Paul can go first.
And I'll be quick to save time. The fastest way to put a lobbyist out of business is to have less power in Washington, D.C. So as I mentioned, I worked on Capitol Hills for years, and there's, you know, they would always be roaming the hallways and wanting meetings with staff and with the member and so on. But I never saw a lobbyist try to lobby a congressman on an issue that wasn't massively controlled by the government in some way. A new tax, a new program, a big expansion, new authority, new regulations. But there was some reason that a company was spending thousands and thousands of dollars on costly lobbyists in Washington, D.C. And that is that they either feared or hoped that some federal exercise of federal power would either help their corporation or hurt their competitors or prevent them from getting hurt. But this is what has made me a fan of limited government. The bigger the government becomes, the more money gets involved and the more special interest gets involved. So my argument is, don't give the lobbyist anything to lobby about. make government as focused and as restricted on our core public needs as possible, and get them out of the business of choosing winners and losers in our society. I just think it's not fair that a big corporation can afford to have lobbyists in Washington, D.C., but some small business, which is hit by the same federal regulations here in Seattle, has no hope of having its voice heard in Washington because they can't afford to have a lobbyist.
Thank you. And go ahead, Andy?
So that's the trick, isn't it? I mean, that's why we're all here tonight, which is how do we implement change as we think it ought to be implemented? And all of us up here have decided that the way we can do that is through information and to do research and to be skeptics and to put things out there. We don't always agree with each other, but we all believe, I think, that information and knowledge is the way forward on this, that an educated population that knows policy, that is passionate about policy, that has lots of different perspectives, is able to push their congressional delegation to make the changes they want. So I'm just making a plug for everybody up here. Read all of our reports and contact your congressperson.
Ross?
Yeah, that's a lot of reading.
Any tips?
I agree that organization and speaking out is the key thing you can do. I do have to really strongly take exception to the idea that this sort of unicorn put out there by Paul, that somehow we're going to be able to get to this small federal government that isn't going to be worth people's while to lobby on. I mean, that's being put out there by folks who are very much pushing a particular agenda, which is radically risking the social contract that has made America great over the last 100 years, which has allowed us to move forward, and which I think is very dangerous. The basic idea that, Paul didn't say this, so I'll be fair, but you hear all the time, look, our capitalist society depends on lack of regulation. If we just eliminate regulation, everyone's going to prosper.
Hey, I'm not saying that.
I said
If you want to debate somebody who's not here, then you can invent that. But I did not say that we should not have regulation.
I actually said, Paul, that you didn't say that.
Okay.
I hear it all the time. I'm happy to say I'm debating the Wall Street Journal. I'm debating lots of places. It's completely counterfactual. You'd say that the most prosperous countries in the world should be Somalia and Yemen. And we have an important thing that we need to work on and defend. There's absolutely no way that we can be that we can be naive about the incredible power of wealth, corporations, and vested interests in our society. But I think we can also take examples from social movements like the Tea Party recently, where if you have a concerted, powerful voice, it is going to make a difference.
All right, thank you. And I'm sorry, but it's 8:25. We got to stop at 8:30, so I can't take any more questions. I wanted to have one last question. Please come up and talk to the panel afterwards, if you'd like. But the one last question is, and you have about a minute each to respond, is if you have one piece of advice that you can give to the super committee on how to responsibly and fairly reduce our national debt, what would that piece of advice be? And why don't we start with you, Paul, since you haven't been able to go first for a while.
Okay. Well, I'll keep it short and sweet, and I guess I would quote Abraham Lincoln. How about that? You can't lose with that. And my advice for the super committee, as individual members, so there are 12 members of this committee, and again, I worked in Congress for quite a bit, so I watched how members operate and how they think and talk to each other behind closed doors. And so my piece of advice from Abraham Lincoln would be trust the people, and that is something that appears to be controversial and virtually political suicide inside Washington, D.C., like the bridge to nowhere for so many years. Oh, of course, we have to fund this pork barrel project. Actually, the American people might find those ideas a lot more acceptable than the politicians on the committee originally thought. So my advice would be for them to have the openness and the courage to consider areas of government that, again, politically in D.C. appear to be untouchable. But if you lay it out to the American people, often you'll find that all of us, the people across the country, are a lot more open to changing the mission and the spending that government does than we originally thought. So get past the labels and look at the actual government spending and see what it does.
Thank you. And Ross, why don't you go next?
We need to take a balanced approach. We need to really look at the revenue side because that's where the deficit crisis is being created by. We need to be investing in jobs, our competitive situation, and a future prosperity, which requires having a strategic approach that allows us to move forward in critical areas like the transition from fossil fuel dependency to clean energy.
Thank you. And Ryan?
I'm going to take 15 seconds and add a fact which will kind of depress us all, which is Bush tax cuts aren't actually a factor in the super committee because they're not, they would have to, because they're scheduled to expire. So that 1.5 trillion that they have to find can't include Bush tax cuts. We opposed them 10 years ago, we opposed them last year, we opposed them, but just keep in mind the scale of the project they're doing. And I would say, you know, you can't be in the kind of business that we're up here without some optimism. You know, it's not too late for statesmanship. This super low level of public confidence in Congress needs to turn around, and the super committee has an opportunity to do that, and the only way they can do that is if they set aside some of the parochial interests they have all, and positions that are based on truly held beliefs of, I can't raise taxes, or we have to spend every single dollar we have on a national defense. You have to kind of rise above your history as a politician, use the skill you have as somebody who's useful, and make some good decisions based on what works for the American people.
Thank you. And Andy?
Well, thank you very much. Kind of a wonky point of discussion. My understanding actually is that the Bush cuts can be considered because there's nothing actually in the legislation that stipulates what baseline they need to operate under. Maybe we should talk about that afterwards.
We have looked at this at length, and I'm happy to talk. But of
Okay.
course, so yeah.
But that said, you know, I would go back to my opening remarks that I don't think we have an immediate deficit crisis. That what the immediate crisis right now is our economic crisis, and we need to be investing in things that we know that work, that will build our economy. That if we can't do that, we can't do anything significant around deficit or debt reduction. But we have this panel, we have this super committee that's come together, and they're going to have to do something. So what would I tell them? Well, I would tell them, as has been said before, we need a balanced approach. We've already cut $1 trillion as part of this process. Now it's time to take a serious look at the revenue side of the ledger, that we can get rid of some of these unproductive tax breaks that we've identified here today, and we should look at some tax rate increases. Maybe or maybe not, they can include the Bush tax cuts. We'll argue about it in a minute. And finally, we need to protect programs for the most vulnerable among us. That we can't chop Medicaid, we can't chop temporary assistance for needy families, the earned income tax credit. All of these things are a crucial part of our economic structure, and they benefit all of us. And if we whack those things, we're really harming ourselves and our future prosperity.
Well, thank you, and thank you to all the panelists, and thank you for coming, everyone, and participating in this conversation. This is only the beginning of the process, and we hope you continue to stay involved. Website information for all of the panelists is contained in the program. So if you want to continue, you can come up now and continue the conversation, but you can also continue it online. And also from the League of Women Voters, I brought some TRIs, we call them TRIs. They're a list of all of the of your elected representatives and how to contact them. So they're out there on the table. Please take one. Thank you.